I'd like to say it's good to be here this afternoon. It's good to see everyone out. Actually, it's this evening, isn't it? So I was incorrect. Jeff, I should have known after 6 o'clock it goes from afternoon to evening. And so we find it's good to be here. We do appreciate everybody's presence with us. We know there's those not with us, and we want to remember them in our prayers, whether they're traveling, sick, or whatever their need may be. We want to remember them. So tonight, technically, we're supposed to pick up around verse 23, verse 24. How you doing this afternoon?
Yes, sir.
Good to see you. So I guess that's where we'll begin tonight. Reed, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and do a few opening remarks.
Yes, sir.
Won't go too far back and digress too much, but we got Paul here at Athens now, and he's going to be speaking here at Mars Hill. And we find that the men there in that city spent a lot of their time doing nothing but listening to and talking about the different gods and strange gods. It was always waiting to hear something new or different. And in a sense, as Paul begins to address them here, he doesn't attack them and criticize them straight up and hard on. He kind of eases into the conversation because he tells them, I perceive that you're too religious here. I think my version here says too superstitious, okay? And we talked about that they were very religious. They had set up all these different idols to these different gods. Didn't want to leave anybody out. They thought they had all the bases covered, And so we find that Paul is going to talk to them, and as he does, one of the things that they did, they took him, verse 19, and brought him unto the Areopagus to say, may we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is, for thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. They knew a lot about all the different Greek and Roman gods, and of course gods from other cultures that no doubt had blended in there from the world throughout. And so, this is a new doctrine, for one to be resurrected from the dead and to be died for your sins and the sins of mankind. They were used to, and I think Reed alluded to it last week as you studied the Roman and Greek gods. They were always playing chess with each other, and this god here, he'd be gone for a while, or die for a while, and he'd come back, and he's trying to fight this god, and the picture I get in modern terms is almost like a modern Star Wars movie. But anyway, this is what's going on here, and it was strange to them to hear about that doctrine of Jesus Christ. And I think last week, too, we talked about that even today the gospel is a distinct message, isn't it? Even in the religious world around about us, we have a lot of people in different religious groups confess that God is the Creator. Jesus is His Son, and He died on the cross for the sins of many. But what separates the doctrine is the depth of it about salvation. And so that is distinct. The plan of salvation, right?
It's said that when he was alive, that the Pope John Paul II or whatever, he spent something like 10 to 12 hours a day in prayer.
Yeah.
He was a very religious man.
Oh, yeah.
He was a very sincere man, but he was wrong.
Right. Well, yeah, right. Well, that's the Apostle
We're
Paul.
wrong.
Sure, that was the Apostle Paul. You can be a very religious person. You can be a very zealous person. Paul to the church at Rome, when he talked about Israel, said that they were zealous people, but they were doing it without knowledge. And so you can be that way. We know there are people that not so much out here in rural, but in town a lot of times be on bicycles and things, and it'll be the hottest day in August, and they'll be going door to door knocking. So they have a zeal for what they're doing, but they don't have the knowledge. And this is what the Apostle Paul was trying to bring unto these Athenians that was here, and that's what verse 21 calls them. And so he stood in the midst of Mars Hill, and ye men of Athens, I perceive that you are too superstitious or too religious. So he kind of opened it up to them in a very courteous manner. He recognized the fact that that they were religious-minded, okay? If they wasn't, they wouldn't have set up all these different idols. But all the things they were doing, as we're going to find, is without knowledge. Without knowledge. And so we find that picking up at verse 23 for this, well, as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription: to the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. And Reed, I thought it was real interesting, what you brought up last week. They had set this up, to an unknown God, okay? And there are different thoughts of what this means, and anyway, we won't get into all that, but I thought it was real interesting what you had brought up about how some of the temples had deteriorated because there were so many of them, and they were changing these gods, and this temple would fall in disrepair, and then they'd go back and resurrect it up again and rebuild it, and the thought was that this may have been a temple that had fallen in disrepair, and years later been raised back up, but they were so busy finding all these other new gods and things, Daniel, they forgot who the temple's for. I thought that was interesting, And so they named it, well, since we don't remember who it is, let's make sure we don't leave anybody out to the unknown God. And yes, he was unknown to them, the true and living God. And this is what Paul is going to get into here shortly. And I like the way he phrased that. Who therefore ye ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. And basically Paul says, this is a God that you're very unskillful and unknowledge of. That's what the word ignorant means. Unskilled and unlearned, lack of knowledge, things of that nature. So, the Apostle Paul is approaching them on a sense of common ground. And I think we talked about that last week. A lot of times when we're talking to people about things of religion and that, we try to find some common ground to pick up on, and we expound upon things from that point. And so this is what we see happening here. And Reed, I'll turn it over to you.
I want to go back. I want to carry on with that idea of the unknown to begin my notes here. This is to be uninformed about, to not know anything about, to be ignorant of. But some other cases that the word is used in some other areas is to not know a certain person, to not have any knowledge of this person. It's a personal thing. But then also to pay little or no attention to not recognize or to disregard something, or to fail to understand, with implication of lack of capacity or ability not to understand something. And then to be unaware of one's wrongdoing, as in to sin unintentionally. So, while the grammar of it is the more personal sense, not to know concerning the person, really all of those things kind of fit in here. Those definitions fit in here with what's going on. We don't know anything about this. And that's what Paul is going to do, is he's going to go all the way back, and he does in verse 24. He goes all the way back to creation. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. The God who made the world and everything in it. Now, he's taking this unknown. You've got this temple here. Let me describe to you this God, who this was. So he's going back and he's reminding them of knowledge that once was there. They once had knowledge of this God. We remember God did not leave the Gentiles without excuse. He didn't. He was always there in some way that they should reach out after him. We have that here in Paul's message later on down that we should reach out after him. He's not very far from any one of us. In him we live and move and have our being. We are even his offspring. So God has not been very far, but the knowledge is no longer there. They've lost that knowledge of him somewhere along the way. That temple has been buried. Paul is about to reconstruct that temple and bring it to them. And as we said, Paul, looking at this message and the way that Paul is presenting it, he's not necessarily, in some way he is, but not totally just describing God. He's really giving them something. What is God? What is this being that we worship? You know, you ignorantly worship this. You create these idols. You create things out of gold and silver and wooden images. You created all these things. But what really is God? And last week I said, you know, He's a creator. He has no needs. He is not distant. And then for my notes today, I went and finished this out. And we see that He has descendants. You know, it's not just Him. He actually is involved in this world, and He has people, humans, that are descended from Him, and He is just. He desires righteousness. There's a strike against most of the Greek gods right there, for one to desire righteousness. And then, and we see that He's going to be a judge, but I kind of included that in that He is just. He wants the right, and He wants to know the right and the wrong. He's going to divide the right and the wrong. He's going to require right and wrong. He overlooked ignorance, but now commands that all men everywhere repent. And then the final thing is that He can raise the dead. And that is going to, everything else has been good up to that point. Yeah, that describes a God. Yeah, that's a God. Yeah, that's what a God is. And then a God raising the dead. A God raised. There are a few cases in mythology where somebody did come back, where Hades did allow somebody to come up from the kingdom of the dead. And I believe there's a handful, maybe one or two instances where somebody was able to escape from Hades. But not in this sense. Not in the way that this is being presented. This is nothing like this. When he gets down and they see that we're talking about a man who really is Jesus Christ that has been raised from the dead. He doesn't say it here, but we know that this God has sacrificed Himself for mankind and has raised Himself from the dead. Now we've got a point of contention. Daniel?
This preaching that He's doing here doesn't necessarily have to be a preaching going all the way back to preaching just God, because there's Jews already in Athens. They know about God.
Right.
So He's having to really spell out Jesus, not God.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
we should know.
Yeah, that's where all this is going.
Yeah.
He had found a common denominator here. You know what I mean? A way to approach this and say, okay, I'm gonna begin this conversation with something that they have a knowledge of, but it may be just a very basic, simplistic concept of it. But it is common ground to start and build on, because down toward the end of this chapter, where does he wind up with this? The judgment. He winds up with Jesus, doesn't he?
Yeah. In verse 31, he talks about that he has fixed a day on which He will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom He has appointed. He's brought this one man into the world, and you know, I don't know if this is the exact word for word message of the Apostle Paul, or rather this is kind of just a summation of what Paul said there on that day. Don't really know, but even still, just the things that he does say here. We've got a man who has been appointed, and he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. You know, God has taken this individual in maybe kind of a sense of what they're used to, and God using somebody and bringing them for a purpose and using them for that purpose and then dropping them. But God actually raises him from the dead. God actually brings him back. And so when they hear of the resurrection of the dead, some mock, others say, we'll hear you again about this. So Paul went out from their midst. There's always going to be those that mock. You know, there's always going to be those that scoff, that sneer at, make fun of maliciously, is what we're looking at here. Peter addresses this in 2 Peter chapter 3. I wanted to run over here and look at this because it's kind of very, very similar to this. In the last days will come scoffing, following their own sinful desires. Chapter 3 and verse 3. Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. They overlook this fact. And that overlooking there, we might we might even look at that as willful ignorance. You know, they overlook those things there. To succeed in avoiding attention or awareness. They overlook this. They avoid giving these things attention. We're just going to ignore these little facts over here. That the heavens existed, they were formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. But by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept to the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. Do not overlook this one fact. And there we are back to that same thing. We don't want to avoid giving attention to this. Pay attention to this one fact. 2 Peter is the whole epistle, is the word I'm looking for. The whole epistle, the whole letter is remembrance. I'm reminding you about these things. Peter's coming down to the end here. This is my life. If I have one thing left to say to you, catch this. Do not overlook this fact. One day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. And the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. And that idea of exposed, we've looked at that in lessons past there, that they will be found destroyed, dissolved, burned up, completely gone. There's not going to be any of this matter and this substance that's going to be left. You know, when we have a fire here, you have the ashes. You have things that didn't burn up completely. That's not going to be the case at the end of this life. Everything is going to be gone. Everything is going to be, and then in another sense, everything is going to be exposed in that all the works of mankind are going to be exposed. Everything's going to be brought to light, and everything's going to have to be accounted for. So it's kind of the same message that we have over here that Paul was preaching to Areopagus, that you have this being who checks all of these boxes, and if we find a being that does all of these things, then that's who we want to give attention to. Then that's the one who has the authority. What is a God? A God is these few things here. The creator. He has no needs. He is not distant. He has descendants. He is just. He desires righteousness. And he can raise the dead. We found an individual. We found this deity, this person that can do these things. That's who we need to worship. That needs to be the object of our devotion. And so Paul has this individual, and so he says the times of ignorance God overlooked. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands that all people everywhere to repent. This is a different word than what we were looking over there in 2 Peter. This is to disregard as not worthy of one's notice, or to indulgently take no notice of something. You know, kind of like a parent turning a blind eye to the child's disobedience, just kind of indulgently overlooking what's happening over here. That's kind of the sense that we're looking at here with God. Is that all this sin, these things that were going on, God kind of overlooked those things, not necessarily turned a blind eye to them, as those things were still being counted towards as unrighteousness, but kind of holding off judgment on those things and not really giving any consequences to those yet, because there's a time that's coming. Because a man is coming in which he will judge the world in righteousness. And this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now the Areopagus is facing a choice. You have this God who has the power to raise from the dead. He's overlooked all of your sins. He's been indulgent to you this far. Now what are you going to do? Now what choice are you going to make? See, I want to go back up to verse 29 now. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone or an image formed by the art and excuse me, imagination of man. See, God is not like anything that we can ever imagine. God is not like anything that we can ever imagine. We sometimes look at Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27, we being made in the image of God, and sometimes we think of that as being the physical form of God. I think that's more the spiritual side of God. This is not the physical form of God. This is not what God doesn't look like a man. I don't know what God is. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, when the trumpet shall sound, this mortal shall put on immortality. We will all be changed. What we will be has not yet been revealed, but we do know that we'll be like him. Whatever the form of God is, we'll be like that. We will be changed from this form into something completely different. So it's unimaginable what this God looks like. And so Paul says, you're wasting your time trying to prove yourself to be the descendants of something that's gold or silver or a stone or an image that's formed by the art and the imagination of mankind. The imagination of mankind is not enough to picture the image of God, what God truly is. So don't be going after these vain idols, these images, these things that are just created that aren't even anywhere near the image of God. Rather be focused upon the things that we're supposed to be doing in our worship to God and our actions towards God as our worship to him. And then when that day does come that God is fixed, that he will judge the world in righteousness by this man that he has appointed, the one that he has raised from the dead, we will find ourselves in favor of this God. So your conundrum is you have an unknown God. We don't want to offend the unknown God. We don't remember who this temple was, so we're just going to put this altar there, and we're going to throw some idols in there, and that's going to be this God, and hopefully we can appease it. That's the conundrum. Now the true God has been revealed. What are we going to do? Are we still going to choose to try to appease this God? Well, it's not going to be by the temple. It's not going to be by these idols and these images and falling down and worshiping them and bringing these things to them and doing participating in all sorts of unrighteousness as part of the worship to this God, but rather living our lives in righteousness in accordance to what this God has fixed. Then we will appease him. So the unknown God is no longer unknown, but what choice or what are we going to do with it? Brother Bobby?
Yeah, I mean, you covered a lot of territory there. In that, but that's true. This is the God that he's declared unto them. You know, when you go to verse 26, and there's a lot of interesting statements that's made here. You went into pretty good detail. Let me go back to verse 26. God that made the world. You know, there was a lot of ideas and thoughts and philosophy on how the world was created and made and how it was functioned. So Paul declared unto them, this is a God that made the world and all things therein. Okay? This one God, not a multiplicity of gods battling for real estate that belongs to the earth or not, or the sea, like Neptune or whatever, you know, that they had going on. This is that God. Something else real interesting here. He dwelleth in temples, he dwelleth not in temples made with hands. You know, these were man-made temples, wasn't they? But you know, when you look at this same message could have been taught to the Jews also. Because what did they have that was man-made? A temple in Jerusalem. You got to remember, the temple wasn't destroyed to AD 70. And the church now is operating in the shadows of that man-made temple. Yeah. Just like here, this unknown God, I guess you could say the sense is operating in the shadows of all these man-made temples. Well, that had to be taken out of the way. Just like after Jesus was resurrected and the church age came in, God is not worshipped by men's hands any longer. All those blood sacrifices and giving and all those hand things that they had to do was done away with. And he's telling them the same thing here, that these gods in these temples, this has got to be done away with. They have no value. And so this is why he says, neither is worship with men's hands as if he needeth anything. Well, today we don't worship with men's hands, do we? That's been done away with. The Jewish system's been done away with. And so he's telling them that this Greek idolatry and Roman idolatry too needs to be done away with. There's no value or anything in that, Brother Conn.
The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So everything here that he needs, he got it. It's at his disposal,
Right.
at his hand.
Right.
And it's interesting to notice that the semicolon after that word with that is not worshipped and dwelleth not in temples made with hands, semicolon after the word thing in verse 25, continued thought. All the verses there is tied together,
Right.
24, 5, 6,
Right.
7, and actually 8, all of them, because they got semicolons. It's a continued thought of what God has done, including what man must
Right.
do.
Right.
And that'd be verse 27. He got to seek after the Lord. I'm telling you how the Lord is in these other verses, and you need to seek after him because you'll be happy if you find him, and you will find him because, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be open. That's some of Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
But I'm just saying this continued thought there in each one of them verses from one to the other. And they're all tied together. And it finally ends down there when it says, that we are also his offspring in verse 28. That takes up another thought. But I just thought that was interesting. And I also think verse 26 is very interesting because
That's where I was headed.
it said he has made of one blood all nations for men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and have determined the times before appointed. Well, just like he made man to dwell, well, he knows then all the time. Some time's gonna run out for him at this place, time's gonna run out over there. But that last statement, folks overlook a lot of time, and it said also the bounds of their habitation. I put a lot of interest in that, and I studied it a lot and run it out for a long time. And it said man was so rebellious, and had been, and was still at the time when they were there, they're ignorant in it. They're just ignorant of it. And the bound of their habitation means I'm telling you where to live and where you should stay. But man stepped over the borders. He didn't stay where God told him to stay. Because he'd have been a lot happier if he had, of course. But he didn't. And them verses brings that out. That's a thought that a lot of people won't put a whole lot into. But I always have, and I still will, put a lot of thought in the fact that God told people where to live. This is your best place right here. There's a boundary there. In other words, that's where you are. There's the other boundary somewhere where another group of people are. There are different groups of people sitting in different places. But man, that didn't hold up long. See, man's ignorant. He stepped over the border.
Well, a lot of this too has to do with the fact that these Greeks that he's speaking to here was kind of like the Jews. They had a sense of pride and feeling of prejudice because you got to remember the Greeks prided themselves in what? Knowledge.
Paul could see real quick. He could see that they was real steeped in that superstition, one word for
Right.
it. The other one is the idolatry. They just worshiping idols.
Yeah. And so he
Idolatry.
takes this thing back and has them understand. Wait a minute. All humanity is of one blood. Now, my understanding on all this is unless blood is tainted with a particular disease that's isolated to a certain group, you can't tell where one blood comes from and another blood starts. Well, the reason being, where do we all come from? Adam and Eve, one blood.
Yeah.
You say, well, what about the flood? Well, that was passed through to Noah and his family. We still one blood.
But still one blood, right?
Oh, yeah. So, you know, you ought not think any more highly of yourself than you ought to. You got to consider other people and all that. So, you know, you had that being battled here also. And if I remember correctly, I can't remember the young man's name that came here several years ago. I know he's a relative of yours out of Naples. And this was a verse that he chose to speak on every night. And one of the points that he brought out about this verse is, and Brother Con, you kind of touched on it, that God has determined every event. And if I remember correctly,
Determined every what?
He's
Oh,
determined
yeah.
every event.
Oh, sure.
And the young man talked about Daniel was a man that was put in place by God for that time. And he talked about Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego being put in place at that time. And then the next night he talked about the Apostle Paul. God had determined to put him in that place. And, you know, and so on and so forth. So there is a whole lot in this verse. God has determined our habitation here. God decided where we were born. God decided where we're going to live, right?
Right.
And there are many different nations. Well, you know, when you go back to the Tower of Babel and you look at it, when the dispersion there took place, you can just about trace it back, the different cultures that began to really spring up and be distinct. Well, God said that even today, right now, today, the society that we live in, we recognize people from different cultures either by who they are, by their dress. They come out of that particular habitation, right? I mean, this is what he's talking about here. God had set those things up. And the Greeks needed to understand that these people over here are just as important to God as these people are over here, from these different bounds and habitations. So God had set that up. It's interesting when you look at a timeline and a historical chart on this, that there have been traces to where you can take that Tower of Babel and you can go from that point, and in the early Chinese culture, you find the springing of that. That's a bounded habitation of people, isn't it? You got a bounded habitation of people that's from Pakistan and India and places like that. You know, we call it the Asiatic culture as a generic term. And then you've got the Western culture over here. So there are bounds and habitations of people, where people come from. They're born. God has appointed that time for them to be born in that particular place. God done that. Just like you Greeks here, God chose your appointed time and birth here to be at that place. And it is a very interesting verse. It's a very powerful verse if you stop and think about it. How God had done all these different things. It has, and all this is doing, like you said, all these semicolons that's in here is a continuous thought. It's just like what Reed said. They're getting declared unto them who this God is. It's what this is all about. And this is what they're doing here. And of course, you know, as we look at verse 27, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of you. He said, just God's close by.
You know, I was thinking too, that Paul told the Corinthians, you know, when he was preaching there, that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. That's the 10th chapter, if I remember right, but I don't know the verse, but it's in there. That the earth is the Lord's, fullness thereof. But I'm setting that forth to say that it's important to remind people who owns this earth. A lot of people, you know, may think they own something because they got a deed to it and all that. We claim all places and all that, but that's all discussed in the Bible too. I can't bring it up right now because we ain't got time to go into that. But I'm just telling you, landmarks is important.
Yep.
And, you know, when they drive a stop down, they say, that's the boundary right there, don't go over there, because that don't belong to you. Well, this is that you think belongs to you. It don't belong to you either. It belongs to the Lord. Everything, this earth and the fullness thereof, that means everything in it. That could include what we call the physical creation. But anything that's going on spiritual in there, it's all owned by the Lord. The Lord owns that. It's like He owns my life, your life, each and every one of our lives is very important. Because the Lord owns it. That's property, that's the Lord's property. It's very important.
We're gonna have to close out now with our time. What did you want?
You want to do the 26th first?
Sounds good to me.
That way you can kind of pick up where we left off.
26, okay. I'm gonna close out with that, right on the heels of what Brother Bobby and Brother Connor are saying there. So God has appointed the boundaries, not only just the boundaries, but also periods,
Yeah.
timelines.
Timeline.
Job talks about how God enlarges the kingdoms and brings them back and shrinks them down. How God leads the kingdoms and then leads the kingdoms away, referring to taking them off into captivity. He's appointed all of these things. He's divided the nations up, even though we're all one blood. He's divided them up into their places for one reason alone, and that's in verse 27. That they should seek God. He's put everybody in their place at their time, as you were pointing out, for one purpose, that they might seek after Him. So, what these people have to do here is they have to put aside their purposeful ignorance and find God. No, we can't. It is no longer an excuse to just throw up a temple and say, it's to the unknown God. We don't remember who that was, so there's no longer any excuse for that. You got to find out who it is. You got to find out and you got to seek for it. That's countercultural, because you don't go to Mount Olympus and seek for God. You don't draw near to God. God draws near to you. But there is no journey that has to be taken. Why? They should, so that they would seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward Him and find Him, that He's not actually far from each one of us. He's not actually far from each one of us. You know, I got in thinking about this idea here, this reminded me of in fire service, most important place to look in search and rescue is the first 10 feet inside the door. The most important place to search is the first 10 feet inside the door. 9 times out of 10, that's where they'll be. Safety is right there. Right there. Hellfire is burning. Safety is right there. God is not far from any one of us. As sad as that is, to make it to that distance and not make it any further, think about that spiritually as well. That we are not that far away from God. He is right there. All we have to do is set aside that purposeful ignorance and find Him. And so earlier we said that the question must be asked, what are we going to do with that knowledge now? What are we going to do with this God? And so number 557. God is going to judge the world in righteousness. Someday we'll stand in the bar on high. Someday our record will see. Someday we'll answer the question of life. What will our answer be? Let us stand and sing.